Well, welcome to St. Thomas United Methodist Church, St. Thomas Episcopal Church this morning. We're ready for week 9 in our study of the book of Revelation. We're looking at chapters 17 and 18 today. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Father, it's good to know how things shall turn out in this world, and yet we must continue to live in it. And there are fears that continue to reside among us, and there are concerns that batter against us. And so in the midst of all that we must face on a daily basis, in the best of times, continue to be with us, continue to open our minds and to be able to see you at work in and around us, enabling us finally to place our lives fully in your trust. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, well, we are ready for chapters 17 and 18, but I guess as we jump into this, we need just a bit of review. So we'll do as we did. I want to at least look back at the last couple of weeks and see what we've done. In week 7, when we looked at chapters 12 and 13, we were looking primarily at a series of 7 very short scenes that introduced us to all kinds of cosmic conflict in the world. And those scenes ended with us being introduced to a dragon and a beast that came up out of the sea and a mouthpiece and a beast that came up out of the earth. And if we had any sense about us whatsoever, by the time we got to the end of those 2 chapters, we were a tad bit concerned about what we were seeing and reading. So then we were introduced last week to chapters 14 through 16, and these work almost as a counterpoint to chapters 12 and 13. Instead of the dragon and the 2 accomplices and the mouthpiece, we were introduced then in chapter 14 and following to the Lamb now on top of Mount Zion, along with the 144,000, all of God's people, all of God's saints atop Mount Zion as well, continuing to do what they usually do, and that is to give praise to God. But then we also saw a couple of harvest scenes that I tried to reinterpret contrary to how they are usually interpreted, to let us see that those were actually good things, that God, like a good farmer, actually keeps that which is harvested as opposed to throwing it away. And then the day concluded with us seeing the 7 bowls poured out, which just allowed us another way of being able to see what we had already seen about the plagues, concluding then with the Battle of Armageddon. And so since you all remember exactly what all that was about, I won't say anything further about the Battle of Armageddon. And those of you who didn't listen in, you'll have to watch the video and catch up on that. But the bottom line is that by the time we got to the end of last week, it should have been clear that we really have no need to fear. Our qualms about how life is going to turn out should have been at least partially, if not completely, satisfied. We don't need to fear because, in the end, God has this. God's in control, and we can certainly trust God to remain in control. However, once you hear that piece of good news, you start thinking a bit. Well, okay, that just seems like with the Battle of Armageddon, we got to the end of this book. What else is there left to say? Well, there are many books that we read, at least that I read, and there are many films, when I do watch a film, that after watching it, I think, well, now what happened to so-and-so? What happened after the book was over, or from this point forward, etc. The book of Revelation, rather than just stopping with the victory story, says, now let's hear the Paul Harvey rest of the story. And so that's what chapters 17 through 22 are really going to provide. It's the Paul Harvey rest of the story. And the rest of the story really does for us what the book of Exodus does. If you haven't read the book of Exodus, you may think that when you read about the Exodus and the Hebrews get out of Egypt, that's all there is to be told. But But when you get to that point, you're only at chapter 15, 14, 15 at the crossing of the Red Sea, and there are 40 chapters in the book of Exodus. So there's a lot left to be told. And that's going to take you not only after the Exodus, you got to get through the wilderness, and then you got to get into Canaan. And you don't even get into Canaan at the end of Exodus. You got to get all the way through the laws of Leviticus and get all the way through Numbers to get to the edge of Canaan. And even then you're still not in. You got to go through the long-winded story of Moses telling everything all over again in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's not till you get to Joshua that you finally get in. Well, there are not 147 chapters left in Revelation. There are only 6, but we're doing the same thing in Revelation that is with the Hebrew salvation story in the Old Testament. We're fleshing it on out. What happens after you know that it's going to be a good story, that it's all going to turn out well? Well, you still have to live. You still have to live in a world in which final judgment has not yet happened. So here is, beginning in chapter 17, the rest of the story that enables us to be able to get on with life, knowing that God is victorious. Chapter 17 and 18 are then going to be a negative description of God's victory. How does the world that doesn't want to have a part of God's kingdom, how do they see it? Then chapters 19 through 22 are, and how does the church see God's victory? So we get to do the negative part today and the positive part the next 2 weeks. Clear as mud? Okay, so let's jump in. John is still receiving this vision, and he says, well, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Well, then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The title was written on her forehead, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Well, I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. And when I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And then the angel said to me, well, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. Now this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not and is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose, and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. And then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish His purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. But after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." But then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, 'I sit enthroned as a queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn.' Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, 'Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon! In 1 hour your doom has come.' The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, and precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, and costly wood, and bronze iron, and marble. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. They will say, 'The fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor is vanished, never to be recovered.' The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, 'Woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin.' Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, 'Was there ever a city like this great city?' They'll throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, 'Woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin.' Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you." And then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, "With such violence the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of prophets and God's people, of all who have been slaughtered on the earth." Well, here's our friend Albrecht Dürer. All of chapter 17 and 18 is in that one single image. And like so many of these, the way that you must read it is start at the bottom and work your way up. And if you do, you can tell the whole story of chapter 17 and 18 in that image. Okay, so here's the announcement of the punishment that is getting ready to happen to this prostitute that we are now introduced to. She's sitting on the water. Now, it looks like she's sitting on a beast, and in fact she is in this particular image, but you can see the water behind her. This is just a telescoped image that has got the next few verses in it. John's the dude up on the left top, wondering, yeah, I don't get it, and the angel's having to now explain it to him. So here we go with the explanation. So she's sitting on the waters. This is a caricature of God. We've been introduced now twice to God with waters nearby that reflect the glory of God. We saw that back in chapter 4 or 5, whichever it was, and then again when we were dealing in chapter 15, I believe it was. There are all these caricatures of God, the dragon and the beast and now the prostitute. They're all trying to make you believe that they are divine. So there are 3 of them, just like God is a Trinity. They're seated on the waters, just like God is on the waters. You know, even to the point of the beast from the lamb having the 2 little lamb horns to make you think it's meek and mild, gentle like Jesus, but then when you listen to him, it's got a dragonic voice that lets you know who he really is, et cetera, et cetera. So they keep trying to convince you, but they don't quite get it right. And we're going to see that that's the case here as well. The waters, we're told in a previous chapter, and then again down in 15 and here in chapter 17, that the waters are really godless persons. It's the inhabitants of the earth, those who are telling the beast that they are astonished by the beast, that they want to worship the beast. So this is not God's people by the sea. It's the inhabitants of the earth. The prostitute, she's called a prostitute because that's what the Old Testament says. Our relationship with God is described all the way through the Old Testament as a marital relationship, as husband and wife. The Hebrew people, Israel, is the spouse of God. So to not be faithful, to run after other husbands, is to engage in prostitution, idolatry. So idolatrous relationships all the way through the Old Testament, having another husband, is described in terms of prostitution. This person, here now in the book of Revelation, is called prostitute, which should make our antennae go up, and we're going to be looking for, well, how is this person, or whatever this person represents, how is it engaged in idolatry that is not honoring God? That would be the right question to be asking. Not the kinds of questions we might be asking if we just got through watching Pretty Woman or something like that. Primarily through the Old Testament, but then secondarily as well, primarily adulterous relationships, prostitution, is that which goes on between the ruler of a kingdom and their idolatrous stuff. Secondarily, it's you and me. Because whatever the king does, we tend to follow. But it's a decision that the king makes first of all. So the people kind of get off easy a little bit in the Old Testament, but not really. Here, we discovered that the people, the waters, are in fact offering everything that the prostitute wants. So they're engaged in it as well. What's important, though, is just to see on the front end that somebody is being represented as a prostitute. That's really the important thing on the front end. John has been told in verses 1 and 2 Come, and I will show you the punishment of the prostitute. But then he looks, and she's bedecked out, looking just ravishing. She's dressed to the nines. She has put on the Ritz. She looks great. She has a golden cup in her hand, and things just look marvelous. And John doesn't know what to think because he's been told, come, I will show you the punishment of the prostitute. But when he looks and sees her, it looks anything but a judgment scene. Just nothing at all. So the angel then picks him up and takes him in verse 3 to another place, into the wilderness. We should read that as the angel has now opened up his mind so that he can see things much more clearly than he was up to this moment. He's able to see behind, if you will, the facade and see that things aren't quite as wonderful as they look. And so one of the first things you then notice is that this prostitute sitting on her throne turns out to be rather bestial. In fact, it is a beast. In fact, it's that 7-headed, 10-horned beast. Well, there's that family resemblance all the way back to the dragon. And we're told that the beast comes up from the abyss. It doesn't come from the heavens. Comes from the abyss. Another pointer to the fact that it has been authorized by the dragon. And while there are those who think cities are just the most wonderful thing that humans have ever made, John isn't, at least at this point, all that convinced about it. He, in fact, where this woman is, he describes it as a wilderness. An urban jungle, if you will, a place of disrepute where she has her throne. Well, a wilderness has been punishment for God's people from time to time, like in the book of Numbers, but it has now become the punishment spot for God's primary enemy, this prostitute and the beast that she is astride. Well, as I said, she's wearing scarlet. She looks to be wealthy, but when you look a little closer, you see all the blasphemous names on the heads of the beast that she's astride. You see the 7 heads, you see the 10 horns, and so it becomes very clear, based on what we've seen already, that the beast she is astride is the Roman Empire. And that's beginning now to focus our attention so that we can see and understand exactly who he's talking about. As I said, she's putting on the Ritz. She looks wonderful, which reminds me, as she sort of is in this image, you see all the scarlet everywhere. One of my favorite books is an early piece of science fiction called A Canticle for Leibowitz, written by Walter Miller. Anybody here ever read that book? You just don't know what you're missing. I try to read that every couple of years. I don't read it as often as I read The Lord of the Rings, but I read it often. It's one of those pieces of science fiction that is as good today as the day it was written. You know, so much of it gets out of, it's just stupid after a while, but this one is good. There's a scene in it early on where sort of a priestly religious scene where there is something happening that's not pertinent to what I want to say here, but there's a docile curtain. You guys know what those are? You remember those? Churches don't have them anymore. Behind the altar would be this regal-looking backdrop. Just richly textured brocades, and they were almost always scarlet. That worked as a backdrop behind the altar. Well, there's one in this book that just, you look at it and you think, oh gosh, what great wealth this parish has to be able to have this thing of beauty here. And then you start looking a little more closely and you realize that it's threadbare, it's moth-eaten, it's fallen apart. it's not nearly what it looks like when you first see it. That's the way this prostitute on the beast is. Once you start really studying her, you realize, yeah, it's a little more disgusting than what you thought it was on the front end. She has a golden cup, but when you look more closely, that golden cup is filled with all kinds of abominable things and the filth of her adulteries, we're told. So you just got to look a little closer than what she did on the front end. And not only that, she has a title on her forehead. Do I have another one there? No, I don't. She has a title on her forehead. It's not the cross that God's people have been sealed with. It is rather a form of 666. It tells who she belongs to, because all people are finally owned one way or the other. And what's on her head is that she's a mystery. She's Babylon the Great. She is the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. It ain't good. It ain't good. And worst of all, she is drunk on the blood of all God's saints. She has been devouring God's people. She has been murdering them, killing them. And remembering back that this is probably during the reign of Domitian, we know that things along this line have at least begun to happen. It hasn't come to the end. Domitian hasn't been killed yet, so it's still very much in progress. So you can see here in this image by Blake, you don't see her devouring, but you see the beast she is astride devouring the saints below. Well, John's just astonished at this point. He expected to hear judgment pronounced, but all he really sees is wealth and ostentation and pride. And even though there are things that let you realize it's not quite like you expected, it still looks like she's getting away with her crime. She's not really going to be punished after all. And so, beginning in verse 7, the angel starts speaking again to John and effectively has to calm him down and say, take it easy. I'm getting to that. I just had to set the scene first. So I've set the scene, and now I can begin to tell you how, in fact, she is going to be punished. And so he provides the interpretation that John and we need to be able to realize that this seven-headed, ten-horned beast that's come up out of the abyss that pretends to be omniscient and omnipotent really isn't. But he starts slowly in verse 8 and says that it once was and now is not and will come again. And that just befuddles most of us until you remember that, oh yeah, that's that thing where they're trying to be like God, who was and is and will be, but always falling just a little short. The beast was, now is not, and will be. So it's trying to be God, but just always fails again and again and again. And here's where we're told that the inhabitants of the earth are actually worshiping the beast as well. And then he jumps to the point that lets you know that something I told you way back in week 1 may actually be true. Way back in week 1, I told you that John did not write in code, contrary to what many people say. He wrote in symbols, yes. He wrote in metaphors, yes. But we don't know them simply because we don't read the Old Testament. He didn't write in code that would allow him to get off the hook. If somebody came to arrest him, for instance, he could always, if he wrote in code, he could just say, well, I didn't say that, when he really did. No, he didn't write in code, and that's very clear when you get to verse 9. If you don't remember what verse 9 is, some of you at least got it at your table and can look at it. This is where we are told that, well, first of all, we're told this calls for a mind with wisdom. John is now divulging something that probably should have been clear, but wasn't entirely. So just think, use that thing up between your shoulders, and if you do, you're going to be able to figure this out. And here it is. The 7 heads of that beast are 7 hills on which the woman sits. And immediately, since all of us are historically astute, we immediately know who the angel's talking about, don't we? There is only one city on 7 hills. Actually, there are many cities on 7 hills, but there's only one city that matters that sits on 7 hills. And there they are. John wasn't hiding this. Anybody who read it would know immediately who he's talking about when he says, 7 heads are the 7 hills. It would be as clear to a first century person somewhere within the bounds of the Roman Empire. It would be as clear to that person as it is to you when I start talking about the White House. Or I would say to you, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I don't have to go into details, you know. And it may not be as fully clear to you, but maybe it is, that if I said 10 Downing Street, you would know immediately that I'm talking about the Prime Minister's house over in Great Britain. Doesn't need explanation. Sitting on 7 hills. He's just spilled the beans, and we know who and what and where he's talking about. Now, from that point forward, beginning down in verse 10 and working through 11 and 12, it surely was as clear to the people in the first century as 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was. But it isn't to us. There's a lot of Roman history that just gets murky. And all the stuff he starts talking about, the 10 heads and the 7 heads and the one was and one was not, and all of that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. It seems pretty clear that he's talking about governmental leaders. He's talking about Roman emperors. But how to make complete sense of it befuddles us, befuddles anybody who writes a commentary on the book of Revelation. But the bottom line is simply this. His point is the end has come, i.e. the end is near. Rome, the eternal city, is not eternal. It is not going to last. And we can see it already beginning to falter. One was, one is not, one will come. It's that attempt to be like God that continually falls just short. And if you think, well, gosh, Unruh, you should be able to tell us what it means. We should be able to figure this out. Well, it's kind of like any sort of political cartoon or image from the past. Some, if not most of us, could probably look at this and go, oh yeah, I know that. I know exactly what that's talking about. Some of you can probably do that. That this is Benjamin Franklin's little cartoon talking about, the colonies need to unite. They need to quit being separate if we intend to have any success. But there are other people who look at that and think that's just weird. And even though we might know the first one, this one we probably don't know. And it's a whole lot sooner or more recent than the other one. This is William Jennings Bryan trying now to get the nod for his 3rd attempt to be the Democratic candidate for president. You can see his first 2 didn't go so well. The old poor donkey's bandaged up from the first one on his leg and the second one on his head, and he's having to carry all the external weight of the great commoner off of his tail, and he doesn't really want to do it. The donkey's backing up, trying to keep from going, and all the things that Bryan has said were wonderful are those 2 decrepit wings atop the donkey, and you just know if he does a stride off that hilltop, he's going to crash and burn. But most of us probably don't know that just looking at that image. It escapes us. There are things that continue to escape us in the book of Revelation, although we get the general gist. We get the gist. here are the Roman emperors after Julius Caesar. You can mix and match, you can shuffle them however you want to get the 7s and 10s to work out. It doesn't have Domitian, who'd be number 11. That all fits in there somehow or other. But the bottom line is, that really doesn't matter. The one thing that does matter, you discover down in verses 13 and 14. What does matter is the one who truly is ruler, the one who truly is emperor. It's Jesus. He's the Pantocrator, which is just simply the Greek word that means ruler of all, which is where we're going to be in about, 4 weeks or so? When we get to the last week of November, we're going to be at Christ the King, which is the week that celebrates this. Here's where we end. Church year ends with this, which really shouldn't be a surprise, because then when we come back the next week for Advent 1, we discover that's where we start the church year with, too. We start with Christ the King, not with baby Jesus. We start with Christ the King, and then work our way through the life of Jesus so that at the end, we're right back where we started. God is all in all. This is our story. This is the one we worship and adore. And then verses 15, 16, 17, and 18 flesh it out just a little bit for you. If Jesus is ruler of all, not Roman Empire, well, then those waters, the people on whom the beast is sitting, either on or by, the angel tells John that this may look like it's all working, but it's really not. And so in those final verses of chapter 17, he begins to show how it's really falling apart. The empire is turning on itself, as do all empires ultimately. They implode, they explode, however you want to describe it, so that the moral of the story is that that which is evil becomes divided, and when it becomes divided, it cannot stand. It will fall. A simple biblical understanding that is applied here to this particular story. A house divided against itself cannot stand, said Jesus. And if all of this is unclear, the story ends in chapter 17 with another statement, just like we saw way back at the very beginning of chapter 1. The angel took time to express to John what the 7 stars and the 7 lampstands were, thinking that John probably needed a boost on the front end of this kind of weird vision he was receiving. Here now he gets another boost. And so in verse 18, he's told, the woman you saw, the prostitute, is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. He's talking very specifically about Rome, astride the Roman Empire, the beast. Now, time out for a moment. That doesn't mean that you and I can therefore go, oh, so this is just a historical tale that doesn't do much for us today. Because he's talking about Rome 2,000 years ago. Well, he is talking about Rome 2,000 years ago, the same way that all the way through the Old Testament, they're talking about very concrete, specific kingdoms and rulers and events, but which can then be seen to be archetypical of the way life is generally. And so, yes, he's talking about Rome and the Roman Empire. But then we step back and go, but you know, where I live, there's some of that same kind of stuff happening. And rulers and kingdoms seem to do exactly the same stuff. And then, you know, as the more you think about it, you begin to realize, and that's true all the way through history. It's always been this way. It doesn't matter if we're in Kenya or Britain or China or the US, they all tend to go through this. And so wherever we are, it's not a matter of pointing fingers at all those heathens elsewhere. It's a matter of recognizing how even where we are in our time, 2,000 years later, still is having to deal with governments that, at least at some level, are authorized by the dragon from the abyss. And on it. Now, that doesn't permit us to be silly and goofy about it. I read American history every single day. I read some this morning. I'll read some tomorrow. I read some yesterday. I love the stuff and I read it every day. But I'm not daft. And I realize there's stuff. And any kingdom that does not finally honor God and do what God says, you can pick your poisons along the way, but things like caring for widows and orphans, and God only puts up with that for so long until God says enough's enough. Doesn't have to be that way, but that is the way the empires tend to work. They get caught up in all kinds of other stuff that is, in their minds, more beneficial than caring for widows and orphans and whatever. And so, to come back now to Rome and Rome Empire, we realize that, he was talking about a specific time and place and people, but wow, that sure does speak to us today and where we are. And that's how Scripture works. That's why every week we come and we listen to another sermon by our rector, thinking that we're going to receive some insight into a tale that, it's just a piece of literature, but wow, it still speaks. And God still works. And God still transforms through the midst of these words. This is a pretty amazing thing that we're a part of. It really is. Pretty cool. Okay, advertisement over. That gets us to chapter 18. And this is nothing but a funeral dirge. If Rome's going to fall apart, if Britain is going to fall apart, Spain's going to fall apart, if America's going to fall apart, well, that just makes me sad. So we have a funeral dirge for the empire that is collapsing. And that's what chapter 18 is going to be. Don't read chapter 18 and go, okay, I need to make a chart because it says this is going to happen and then this is going to happen, and so we can chart out the demise. The funeral dirge that happens in chapter 18 is taken whole cloth out of the Old Testament. And it comes from the big three prophets. It comes from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's the funeral dirges that he could just pull straight off the page. He's not plagiarizing. He's just footnoting that this is the way it is. God's already told us how this works. So this is the fall of Tyre. This is the fall of Babylon. And in fact, that's what we're told on the front end of chapter 18, isn't it? Fallen is Babylon. Fallen is Babylon. It's not maybe, it's a done deal. You cannot be on the other side and win. We already saw that. Into chapter 16, Battle of Armageddon. We're just seeing now the full display of it as we get here into chapter 18. You could say that chapter 17 was a political description. I mean, it had Bible images in there, to be sure. But all that other stuff about 7 hills and kings and heads and so on, it's a political description. We're back fully into the pages of the Bible in chapter 18. This is just biblical stuff that's being thrown at us from start to finish. So there's another angel. Angels always continue the story. Our narrator has returned, the angel, and begins to speak a new message about a new scene. And the main thing that we hear all the way through chapter 18 is that the great city, Babylon, has been turned on its head. What then to do? And how to respond to it? Well, it not only has been turned on its head, it has now become a dwelling or a haunt for evil, a haunt for demons, a haunt for all that is bad. Petula Clark may have said that, when you're alone and life is making you lonely, you should always go downtown. Well, yeah, John doesn't agree with that one bit. The great city has been destroyed. It's not where you want to go. You, in fact, want to do what you hear down in verse 4, where there's that message coming from God, "Come out of her, my people." And that's really one of the amazing things in the midst of this story here, is that even in the midst of the judgment against the evil empires, there is this resounding word from God that continues to be heard, that cannot ultimately be ignored. You can say, "I'm not going to answer," but you can't ignore it, and that is the voice of God saying, "Come." It's an invitation always. Even if you're on the other side, you can still come. And that's the story of the Exodus, where so many Egyptians and others do come along with the Hebrews. So even in the midst of the city that is turned on its head, there is still this divine voice saying, "Come, come out of her, my people." And we can if we choose to do so. But there you see, it has truly become a haunt of demons and evil, and the city is collapsing and falling apart. There are two reasons that are given early in the chapter as to why Rome is going to fall apart. The first is that it's engaged in all that emperor worship that they did, idolatry, prostitution, and then also all their economic wantonness, all the things they spent money on rather than what they could have and should have spent money on, and all the things that they thought were near and dear to them in their homes and in their lifestyles, as opposed to those things that really are near and dear to us in a lifestyle that honors God. There are four things in the early part of this chapter that really should be focused on. The first is that word from God, "Come out of her, my people," in verse 4. The second is, down in verse 5, her sins are piled up to heaven. She may think she's getting away with it, that it's hidden, that she's doing it undercover, but it's as clear as day what she's doing. You can't hide what is happening. Third, there is complete denial that there's anything bad going on. "I sit as queen. I will never lose my throne. I am not a widow." And because of the denial, the fourth is this, that her demise will be, as it were, immediate. It will seem sudden. Because you've said it, "It's all fine, it's all fine, it's all fine, it's all fine," and then suddenly you can't keep up the pretense anymore, and it just seems to collapse. That's what's being described here. It's not that it really was exactly that fast, but because of the constant denials, it seems that way. So the latter part of chapter 18 provides us with three different laments that come from three different groups, from kings, from merchants, and from sailors. So the kings give their lament that, it's just terrible. We've always depended on you. We've always loved you. It's so terrible that you're ceasing to be. But notice what the kings do not do, what they do and what they do not do. They stand far off. They're not about to get involved with Rome's demise. They hate it, but that's your problem, not mine. Another piece of that dividing that goes on. And the second thing that happens is the merchants get engaged in the lament as well. They're upset because of the collapse of all the major markets. All the money that they've been getting is going to dry up. And you might have thought, well, how in the name of goodness did John come up with that big list of things? Who'd have thought citron woods and other stuff in that list that was right in the middle of chapter 18? Comes straight out of the book of Ezekiel. That's word for word. It's just this dirge that he picked up and stuck in here in the middle of his book. So there's nothing new about it. It's just a way of saying anything you can think of that merchants would sell, Rome bought. Well, it sounds pretty typical of today as well. Rome is described essentially as a city of merchandise, just always consuming. You know, you don't have to go that far back in time where people understood, they really understood and grasped that consumption is a disease that will eat you up from the inside out. We seem to have forgotten that. We've begun to think that consumption is a good thing, that we can be excited and delighted about, but consumption is still consumption. It ain't good. And then last are the sailors. The defeat of all this, as I said, you shouldn't get out a chart and say, well, I got to start looking for this and this and this. This is a kind of stylized defeat that he picked up from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's not all that different from the way that we watch films today. If you watch films that are action movies, you know, it doesn't matter who the action guy is. It doesn't matter if it's a Western or a car thing or a science fiction. And in an action movie, you're going to reach a point in time where everybody else has been cleared out, and there is the good guy and there is the bad guy. And the good guy is chasing the bad guy, and he's about to catch up with him, and then there's a switch that happens, and the bad guy suddenly gets on top of the good guy, and even though the bad guy's been blowing away good guys all over the place, all movie long, without even blinking an eyeball about it, when he finally gets the good guy cornered, instead of blowing him to kingdom come like he has done with 47 other people in the movie, he holds a gun on him and then begins to describe everything that you didn't quite get in the movie up to this point in time. And then finally says, okay, I've told you enough, click, and then the sidekick shoots him from the side. Or some little other feature from the proponent. And it's like, you bloomin' idiot. You had this wonderful opportunity and you didn't do it. It's a stylized thing that goes on in our movies, and we get it. It's a stylized statement here at the tail end of chapter 18 as to how the empire falls and implodes. But the last line is simply this: to show us how complete the annihilation and demise of the kingdom shall be, there is an angel who symbolizes it by throwing a millstone into the sea. Now, it's not that he's creating a tsunami that's going to accomplish all that. That's literalizing the symbol. He's just showing you that, you know, this big, heavy thing, when you toss it into the ocean, it sinks. And there ain't no way you're going to recover it. That's the point. It is over. It is done. Which was the story, which was the line that was used at the tail end of chapter 16. Whether it's Jesus on the cross, whether it's the Battle of Armageddon, it is done. Which doesn't just mean it's over. It uses that special word that the Greeks had. The aim has been completed. That which the reach that we were seeking has been found. It has been accomplished. It's over. At the tail end of chapter 18, there are then three things that are said to have caused the demise of the kingdom. The first was misplaced priorities. Rome's merchants became as great as kings. Heroes today are usually not political persons. Heroes today are singers, songwriters, actors and actresses. Now, granted, they're important in their own light, but they're hardly heroes of historical nature at any sort. Misplaced priorities. The second is idolatry. They're worshiping other things than God. And third, the very last item that is mentioned is the blood of Christian martyrs, the killing off of God's people. Those three things together finally, if you will, push God to say, enough is enough. And that's all that needs to be said about the beast and the other beast and the dragon and even the prostitute who sits on them. End of story. They're now forgotten, and we move on to the other side, to the good side, to the way God's people see all of this, and that's where we start next week in chapter 19. It'll look we're going to describe the very same stuff, but we're going to do it from the other side, and it will look very, very different. Thanks for coming.